Hello and welcome to Monsterama 2022. My name is Darren Bush. I am the virtual programming director for Monsterama this year. You have joined us for the panel Monsters of Science, which we will try not to do that joke too many times, but I can't promise anything. What I want to do before we talk about our sciencey monsters, I want to let our Monsterama panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll come back and talk about what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start here right next to me, picking on Mr. Rob. Go ahead and introduce yourself to Monsterama.
Hi, I'm Rob Levy, and I am glad to be here. Thank you. And I do stuff for Dragon Con, and not for them, but at Dragon Con, I should say. And then I am one of the hosts of the Modern Musicology podcast on the ESO network, and I do some stuff for needcoffee.com and their Weekend Justice podcast. And I'm a writer, blogger, and podcaster.
Excellent. So next, I'm going to pick on Marlena.
Hi, my name is Marlena Frank. I am a young adult fantasy and horror author. I write everything from novels to series to short stories, novellas, everything in between.
Excellent. And Dwayne?
My name is Dwayne Todd, and certainly good to be here. Like everyone else, I do a little bit of writing, and that's pretty much what I've done my whole life. A lot of technical writing related to science and backgrounds, but I also do some film history and working on some fiction as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And last but not least, Kelly?
Hi, my name's Kelly Frank. I am a artist and author specializing in horror and fantasy. I'm a former academic who escaped the ivory tower.
Excellent. Escaped the tower. I like that. I'm still Darren M. Bush. I am the founder and executive producer of a virtual sci-fi convention on YouTube called Tables of Content. I'm also an Atlanta con runner, not just Monsterama, but also Conjuration coming up in November. And you can see me occasionally near where Rob is at Dragon Con doing panels and speaking and stuff. I want to go ahead and let you guys know that this is, again, the Monsters of Science panel, and we're talking about how science gets a bad rap in a lot of classic horror and a lot of monster movies. And we're going to discuss not just those movies, but also what is it with blaming science for all of these things. I want to, before we get into the gory details, I want to let you guys know that some of the movies that inspired this panel were Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is 90 years old this year. The Ghost of Frankenstein is 80. And Eight-Legged Freaks, which we've almost talked about before on Monsterama, is 20 years old. And because I'm a track director and I can do it, I threw in several Godzilla movies for good measure. So we're going to include Godzilla in on this panel. I see everyone's very upset that we're going to be talking about Godzilla. So let's start right at the beginning, which is, all right, so here's my first question for our panelists. I want you to talk about a memorable moment involving a monster that was science-y. And I'm going to pick on Rob first for this one.
So for me, I have a very early memory of watching War of the Worlds and just a lot of the science that was in that. And, it was the science, the fear of advanced science that, we can't solve, and technology we can't solve. And then the reliance on science to try to solve a problem. And then at the end, it was all spoilers. It was all, the human cold. And just as that high idea of how science is so integral to that movie really made me think about it and think about how the science is in science fiction.
Excellent. Okay. Kelly, you got an answer ready for us?
Yeah. For me, the Alien was one of the first science fiction movies that actually scared me. I grew up with a lot of sci-fi in my house because my mom just would put on like Godzilla movies and stuff, and they were always there. But Alien's the first one that actually frightened me. And when they find out that their science officer is actually an android planted by the company, that was a big shock for me. And it really made me interested in like this whole idea of like, how can science like replicate people and humanity and all that kind of stuff. It was very interesting. So yeah, I really dug that.
Excellent. Dwayne?
I think one of the earliest memories I can think of is the original version of The Fly, which had a lot of science and monster related to it. But I remember it was one of those few movies I watched without really knowing what was going to happen. So a lot of times with older movies, the surprise or the big reveal already. So I remember very well when he's been transformed with the fly's head, and he's kind of got it covered through a lot of the movie, and then all of a sudden you get this big reveal. And as a kid, I'm just like, oh, it's like a shocker that the monster was created that way. So definitely love the technology aspect that went wrong.
Marlena?
So one of the ones that really comes to me that I really fell in love with when I was younger was the Jurassic Park movie, and seeing how science ended up becoming, creating actual monsters. And the book really got into a lot of the DNA aspects of it, which was really fascinating too. But it's, again, so busy thinking, trying to figure out if you could, you didn't stop to think if you should.
Mm-hmm. When I think about this question and your answers, I'm reminded of every time that Star Trek or Star Wars or anybody said, here's this place that it's impossible for there to be life. Oh, by the way, there's life anyway. And sometimes what they did was feasible, but mostly it made me go, that's cute, but no. So excellent. Thank you. That's a good start. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the science here with this next question, which is, can you give us a really bad good example or a bad good example of a memorable moment where science is abused, misrepresented, scapegoated, something like that? Anybody? Kelly?
Can we talk about how hilariously bad the Godzilla American version was, like the one that they like where Godzilla's more like a weird lizard instead of the classic Godzilla, and it's just like got its weird little egg things everywhere running after people. It's just hilarious. I don't know. Godzilla fan. I'm like, no, that's against the law.
So the fact that Hank Azaria did a New York accent didn't save that film for you?
No.
Okay.
No, it
Okay.
did not.
Okay. So can you explain for our fans who aren't soaked in Godzilla as much as some of us what you're talking about?
Okay, so classic Godzilla is basically a metaphor for the dangers of nuclear power and radiation, and how we often like use our abilities scientifically without thinking of the impact that it has on nature. And this one was just like weird monster attack. Oh no. And it's just kind of doesn't really hit on the same keys, and it kind of erased a lot of the themes that made Godzilla special.
Yeah. It was more like an allegory for overfishing cod or something like that.
Yes,
I wasn't quite
which
sure.
is, I mean, I guess, but don't call it Godzilla. You know,
We could do a whole panel on just do your own movie, don't steal the name of a
it
beloved.
could be Godzilla. That would be okay, but
Fair enough. So, Dwayne, how about you?
I guess I think a lot about when you have these, hey, let's just dump some toxic waste, and then a monster emerges, eight-legged freaks, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like they take this really quick shortcut without putting any real science behind it. There's just this mystery about somehow in this mixture of things. Of course, one of my favorite movies, Return of the Living Dead, or Return of the Living Dead. You have that toxic mix that gets loose in Louisville, which is near and dear to my home. So, but it's really cheap writing. It's just so you just take it and then move on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rob, how about you? Oh, you're muted, Rob.
Hey, that'd be good. I hate to talk about Jurassic Park again, but that's one of them. But almost any of those Crichton books that got turned into movies a lot. And the first thing that comes into my head without really thinking about it is sort of The Blob. Just sort of the for all these movies, and also The Thing, the original version of The Thing. There's all these movies where like the one smart person in the room is screaming and pleading that, listen to me, and they don't, and they belittle him or her, and they sort of dumb down science. That drives me nuts. And also, I think to a certain extent, another one where I thought it was kind of out there and strange was, believe it or not, Ghostbusters. It just it was fun, and you're completely willing to ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Was there a particular Ghostbusters technology that you were referring to?
Well, when I saw Ghostbusters in high school, I was with like the one smart kid in high school that knew physics, that was explaining to me that like there is no way that giant monster is gonna when they're going to the hotel and they basically grab them and put them in the box. He's like, there's no way that is going to convert to matter that goes in a box that quickly. There's no way you're going to do it, right? And then later, there's not a scientific way that the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man could manifest itself into reality. And I'm just like, will you please stop? But that's okay, because I thought it was stupid and funny as well.
So I think what you're saying is that Ghostbusters was entertaining enough that we could forgive the weird science premise.
I am one of these people that is willing to forgive things like Ghostbusters or like Weird Science or Real Genius or something that does weird stuff with science, but then gets really mad at the space movies where ships make noise.
Yes.
I sadly am that guy.
Okay, well, no, that's right. We applaud that, being that guy. Yeah. Marlena, how about you?
Well, so one of the things that you see a lot in comic books is when they take animal DNA and they inject it into somebody, and suddenly they get like night vision or bad ears, or you see it with like the Lizard, I think, and Spider-Man and Man-Bat and Batman comics, and it was just a whole thing that was just but you play along with it because you're like, yeah, sure, I'm reading a comic book about a dude dressing up as a bat every night, so suspension of belief, it's great, and but another one that comes to mind is you saw it in The Matrix, especially. I think that's where you started seeing that hacking was portrayed as staring at a bunch of green hexadecimal code flying across your monitor. And they literally had someone, I think, that would just stared at the numbers in the hexadecimal looking for patterns. And, oh my gosh, that was how they were representing hacking at the time. And I was like, oh my gosh, thank goodness that's not how it actually works.
Yeah, it's a tiny bit more complicated than just staring at a screen. having your fingers on the keys helps, I'm pretty sure.
It kind of strikes me, I think, Marlena, it kind of hit on this point of, it's like, if you look over 100 years or even back to Frankenstein, the science, it's like when you're first evolving the science, the monsters are your fears of, well, I don't really understand, which the early versions were a lot of medicine things, like the Dr. Jekyll or Dr. Jekyll, as it was pronounced in the movie version. He's using this, mixes a lot of chemicals and, the science, but medicine was on the rise at that point in time, right? We just discovered penicillin and all of these medical developments. So we play on the fears that it could create a monster. Move forward a few years, you have the nuclear age comes in, Godzilla, as well as all these giant monsters. Well, radiation is going to cause huge monsters to evolve because it plays on those fears. As years go by, I think kind of our minds realize, no, that's not what radiation is going to do. It's actually a lot worse what it does to the body. But then it no longer really works to just call it radiation. Hacking, or I was even thinking, you go through these different phases when computers started to evolve. You have nanotechnology, AI, all of those, which create a lot of great fiction. But again, it plays on the fear of people not really understanding what computers are to begin with, or robots.
Right. Yeah.
and then we move, as a society, we move along a little bit. We become comfortable. We understand it a little better, and then we want something a little more deep. In
Yeah.
terms of, if you're
Yeah.
going to make a monster, think about it a little bit. Don't just throw it in a bucket.
Well, there's that old adage of like, don't ever go and watch a movie about something that you specialize in or that you know a lot about, because you're going to be disappointed. That's just how that goes.
And I think there's an interesting commentary there where science is always kind of on the bleeding edge of understanding a lot of times, especially the latest research, the latest tools, especially in medicine these days. We see that being something that we didn't used to think that was even really possible. And especially when you start seeing robotic limbs now that are able to function almost completely like a normal limb, like in a whole arm and everything. And it's just incredible the kind of stuff that science can do now. But that not that long ago, that was considered like sci-fi or almost magical or impossible, So
There's an interesting sociological take on this, which I think is relevant, although it's not from a movie. And that is that in I think it was 47, an Air Force pilot or somebody like that was describing a UFO to a news person and said that it wobbled like a flying saucer, meaning that it was going like this in the air, not that it was shaped like a saucer. But our American culture went, ooh, it's saucer shaped. And then in the early 50s, every spaceship is saucer shaped all of a sudden, even though that's not what he said.
Yep.
So there's something that soaks in. Go ahead, Kelly.
No, I just like, and now that's the classic shape. You ask somebody to say like what a UFO looks like, it's like, oh, flying saucer.
There's a moment in one of the Godzilla movies that I watched for homework. Terrible assignment. One of the Godzilla movies, this flying saucer flies over Tokyo, and everybody freaked out. Oh, it's aliens from outer space. No, it was a time travel machine that they just happened to build shaped like a flying saucer for camouflage. I don't know.
Well, and I think it's interesting how as soon as that report comes out and that gets around over a period of years, then people latch onto that as that's what they're describing things as, because otherwise you'd have to go into a lot more detail about what something is. And then, but it's just easier just to say, this is the lay term flying saucer, instead of trying to come up with something more detailed or trying to draw it out or something like that. So it's interesting how people just latch onto something that easily encompasses, but isn't exactly what they maybe saw.
Yeah.
And I think some of that too is, people that tell stories either for magazines or books or print or screen or film, they have to digest a lot of science into small bites for the average person. So I think something like the evolution of the idea of the flying saucer kind of falls into that. In the same way that, there's all the things that we get with time travel. There's a lot of these sort of tropes, I think, come out of a making science simple thing. And I think that has led to a lot of the tropes that we have in a lot of movies. You alluded to Alien, the trope before Alien, the tropes that robots always looked like robots, right? And one of the great things, which I think you alluded to as well, is that Alien sort of put that on its head, which I thought was really cool, right? So I think sort of like it depends on this is kind of horribly pedantic, but I think it depends on the education of the audience for science that's watching it, And in the 50s, one of the reasons why these movies were so gloriously fun is that, we weren't really teaching science or nuclear science in schools. So it was all this like big mystery thing.
Yeah.
And that sense of mystery and wonder, in the same way that, when people from foreign lands would colonize different places, it sort of mystified them, right? I think it's sort of fake magic kind of a thing.
And I think building on that, people would, hide under your desk. That's what you should do when there's a nuclear bomb about to hit. And of course, that's not going to do anything. But that's the closest, that's the easiest thing to compare it to is a building collapse. That's the easiest reach for people instead of trying to go into all the details and terrifying people, school children and stuff at the time. So, yeah, it's interesting to me.
Yeah.
Well, culturally, there's this idea of like we create a shared reality based on our general conception of what we view as what's true in fact. So if we see like, if we know that nuclear is bad, then we're going to associate it with all kinds of terrible things. It can catch people on fire. It can blow up a building. It can, make the building collapse. It can make monsters get huge out of nothing. It can cause giant rabbits. It can do anything. So as it gets more pared down, I think that instead of us being more educated about it as a whole, there's always new technology for people to be scared of, and that's going to be the new culture of. I guess people are trying to understand it more as they kind of explore it in fiction. But even now, you'll see people who are highly against like artificial intelligence, for example, and they're very much against that kind of thing, and they're against it because they've seen a lot of movies about it, not because they've actually done any research on how it functions. So I don't know.
Yeah, I have this weird sense that if there were science fiction movies in the the mid 19th century, right, 1840s, 1850s, that they would have had a movie where this guy accidentally fell into a locomotive's coal bin and it turned him into Coal Man, and he was 45 feet tall and he went around stomping on people with carbines.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, you've got the Lumiere, Trip to the Moon silent films where people were like really freaked out by that, and even the early films of trains, being filmed for short. People were like running because they thought the train was going to come through the screen. So this is sort of something fundamental in our DNA, I think, as a species of the unknown scares us.
And I think
you can really play with that in interesting ways if you're a storyteller and make it work.
Dwayne?
And I think even like when you go back into the 1800s, when you start getting before the Age of Enlightenment, if you or science, where we become a very rational, science-based society. Yeah, I know that sounds crazy, but there's this huge influence of the medicine, development, science. Before that, where do the monsters come from? Well, their mythology or their nature or their mysticism, witchcraft. All of we assign fears of the unknown of these things we don't really understand. And so at least when there could be some developments out there in stories and things like that, but I think that's why it's just an interesting connection between developments in medical science and Frankenstein, the book being written at that time when there's this explosion of medical advancements, in life, as well as Darwin's theory that, maybe we weren't created, we evolved. And so you naturally go to, well, we can create life if life could be created out of nature. So there's it's always like these extensions of what we're learning and developing and processing, I think, as a people, as a culture, and as a society.
Yeah.
Kelly?
And I really want to piggyback on that because I think you're absolutely right. And it makes me think of we talked about Frankenstein earlier, but you also have Dracula coming out around that same time period. And Dracula is sort of the opposite of that, where you do have Dr. Seward and you have characters that are very scientific, but then at the end they have to resort to what Van Helsing knows, who he says he's a man of science, but there's nothing scientific about a vampire. And so sort of a rejection of science in place of going back to those old myths, while also looking down on the foreigner and the old myths and things like that. So I do think people pair Frankenstein and Dracula together a lot, like they're the same, but they do have very different readings.
Let's be very clear. Shelley's Frankenstein is science fiction. She takes the science and medicine and technology of the day and goes to the next step. Maybe not accurately, but that's not the point. She goes to the next step and she gives you consequences to have to deal with. It's perfect, pure science fiction. It is not fantasy. Now, whether Dracula is science fiction or fantasy, we don't have time for that discussion right now, but I would love to have that argument with you guys because I have many opinions about the answer to that question.
Same.
There's this wonderful moment, there's many wonderful moments in Dracula when you're confronted with the modern age of psychiatry and all of the things that Seward talks about in that. And it's very well written and it's very well done and mostly irrelevant to the actual conclusion of the story, but still pretty good. So, Marlena, did I cut you off?
No, I was just going to say, I think that whenever technology and technological advances are always created by people. And people, I don't care how much you try to prevent something from having any flaws, there's always going to be some kind of flaw. That's just, there's always a percentage of randomness or error that's going to come into anything that's created from, programs or, computers or whatever. And I think that percentage, that tiny percentage, is always what gives people pause and gives them some level of fear of what's coming next, of what the new technology could lead to or what the new technology could be. But it's really just, it's created by people and people make mistakes. Someone might have had a bad day when they were programming a single line of code and, now it has this outcome that's, I read Asimov's I, Robot recently, and it was interesting to me that even though it's talking about robots the whole way, a lot of the concepts of ethics in that and trying to figure out how to program that properly into computers is still something that's debated today.
Yeah. Asimov's robot series is an excellent example of some of what we're talking about because he came up with a really great idea and then he came up with 3 different ways to break it and made them into essentially murder mysteries.
Yeah.
It's brilliantly structured. And Dwayne, you had something?
Oh, I was going to just piggyback. I was thinking when prepping for the panel about 2 movies. One's kind of a remake, The Invisible Man. So you have the original Invisible Man where he takes a potion and it makes him invisible, right? Well, no one in today's society would accept that concept, right? Back, many years ago, I'm sure they suspended it and thought, wow, chemistry, maybe we could do something like that. So the new Invisible Man, I don't know if you've all seen it, but he creates a suit that's got all these little reflectors that causes him to be invisible, which I just, I'm generally not big on remakes, but I thought it was fascinating how they took the modern technology and said, hey, let's rethink how this might work and try to come up with something, from a technology perspective that would allow a person to be invisible, so to speak. So,
yeah. And the Kevin Bacon movie, The Hollow Man, which was basically an Invisible Man kind of off to the side remake, I think they were exploiting some of the rules of quantum mechanics, that they basically tricked every molecule in his body to let the light pass through it or something like that, right? Yeah. Which the fact that they did a really good job of making the science seem almost kind of plausible did not prevent it from being a really interesting kind of mediocre movie about a psychopath who had magic powers.
Yeah.
So, okay. Anything else? I think we took like 15 minutes to answer that one question, which is great. Anything else on this before we move on to the next question?
Oh, I just wanted to add also about Asimov. You can't forget that basically the Turing test is based on what he came up with. So how you can differentiate between a human and a robot, basically. If a AI can pass the Turing test, then it basically can trick any human into thinking that it's real. So then how do we indicate that it's not human? And it makes me think of that Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, a measure of a man with data, and how do you tell if he's, personhood and all that. Now, oh boy, then we start to get into some real stuff with science,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because you also start to, like me personally, I want to then talk about all of the actual scientists who wrote science fiction.
Oh,
because Arthur C. Clarke invented not invented, but he's the one who figured out the best place to put the satellites for the GPS system 10 years before anybody thought of GPS satellites, and it's called the Clarke orbit. So if you're reading an Arthur C. Clarke science fiction novel and he starts talking about orbits, he's right.
He knows what he's talking about.
Don't doubt his science at that moment. He knows what he's talking about. Asimov is an excellent example of that. Robert Heinlein is another good example of that. There's others.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, you start talking about what Asimov did with what he knew of science. Those are great examples. Great examples. All right. So speaking of Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein, let's flip this over completely the way and say, if you're going to publish a really thick book about science fiction, I'm thinking Asimov, The Expanse is a new new version of this, but also like Andy Weir's The Martian, where he's working really hard to have everything make actual sense and in physics and space travel. Probably pretty good examples. Interstellar is another one where the physicists help write the story, those. But often we're confronted with science fiction movies where those of us that are fans that have any science background at all, have to kind of go click and turn that part of the brain off to see if you can actually enjoy the movie. I think somebody mentioned this earlier. Why do we dumb down science so much for movies, and do we actually do a good job of it? Anybody want to take a crack at this one?
Sure, I'll jump in.
Go,
So I think some of this is that, we as a culture want to consume media that is very, processable and disposable easily, right? This goes back to things like King Kong, where it's like, okay, it's an ape, he has a girl, he climbs a big building, right? Or to a lesser extent, the Americanized Godzilla movies, right? I think that we want to be able to make a movie or a book or, specifically for the general public. The idea of a niche film or a niche book or comics sort of is a fairly recent probably development in the last 25, 30 years, right? But I think that generally people are looking for escapism. And I think it's, do we pander to people that like science and want fun, or do we pander to the escapism? Because in many ways, those films of the 50s and even some of the horror films of the 30s were escapism from the real world, where we didn't care. It was just silly, right? When you watch one of the films you talked about here, Ghost of Frankenstein, it makes no sense, right? But it is just absurdly stupid fun, right? So I think that's part of it too, is at some point, if they start making movies that are scientifically accurate, then where does the imagination go? Where is how does the theater of the mind play into it? And where do we make the difference between entertainment and science? I think there's science films and science television, but then there's also science entertainment. This is kind of how I look at it. And I'm perfectly fine with going to a movie and switching off. You want to be able to just be wowed with technology and the way things explode, and ooh, look at that big shiny thing, right? And I think that's primal for us. But I also think that we have because of the onset of science fiction, and those of us who are careful and persnickety about these things, we made an effort to read Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke and Neil Gaiman and different writers that sort of have elevated us to like, well, this has got to be great. I think this is why, and I keep going back, because Alien is such a game changer, because it did all of the things that an entertainment film does, but it also did all this cool science stuff, right?
Yeah.
In a way that was entertaining, that the average guy could go see, and it's not 2001 where they're like, what the hell is this, right? So I think that's part of it. And I also think too that, we like to not think much when we're going to a movie. I know I don't. And I have a very good friend of mine who's a physicist that I cannot go to movies with because of this.
I could see that being a problem. It's like going to science fiction with Neil deGrasse Tyson, or
a baseball game.
You know what you're in for,
yeah.
Right? Kelly, you were going to say something?
I totally agree with you, and I just wanted to add, like, as a person who used to teach college freshman English comp, I can tell you that we talked about this a lot as faculty, and the big issue that we had to overcome was that the average American right now reads at a 5th grade reading level. So most movies are going to have to appeal to no higher than a 5th grade reading level. So if they're going to go any higher than that, it's pretty much guaranteed to not be one of those movies that's going to do really, really super well at the box office, unless it does have explosions and all that kind of stuff. So like Interstellar was really well received, but was it like a blockbuster? film that like kept raking in tons and tons of cash and all this stuff. Like it was well received critically, but it's not going to do as well as like, you know, like Twilight did or something like that. You know what I mean? It's not on the same. It's in terms of like what the studios are going to invest in, it's not going to be on the same level. So I don't know. I hate to be the Daisy Downer here, but we used to talk about this all the time, and that was how we had to select books for students with stuff that was on a higher level, but also like how you can like break it down, because a lot of them had never been exposed to challenging pieces like that. And don't get me started on high school and stuff like that, because I will have feelings.
Apparently.
Yeah.
So, Dwayne or Marlena, anything on this?
Yeah,
Marlena?
I wanted to add in that I really think Alien is a very good example. Rob, you mentioned that for this. And one of the problems I think post Alien is you had something like Prometheus that was meant to be a sequel to Alien. And I don't want to give spoilers away for things, but it didn't live up to the science rigor of Alien at all. And I think the premise for Alien made it seem like Prometheus would be kept up to that same rigor. And I think setting expectations for your audience when you go into any piece of media is what's really necessary. If you're going to flub science, they'll have a certain level that they'll be willing to like turn off their brain for that, but after that they'd be like, nah, I'm checked out, this isn't realistic enough for me.
Yeah, piggybacking on the notion about the reading level, I'd always understood that like television for decades was written to where a 5-year-old to 6-year-old should understand whatever's going on, and I think that's what happens with a lot of trying to make the appeal. And I think in looking at science fiction and movies particularly, you can't avoid the impact of Star Wars. The original Star Wars had, because it became the world's first global blockbuster, and the amount of money it raked in changed how studios looked at movies. And I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I grew up on it, love it. It's not science fiction, it's fantasy, and it's completely suspend what you might, but I don't care. I love the movie. So I think that had this influence all along. So even a movie like Alien, which was, a game changer for me as a child, it went back to a very simple, even though there was science, there's the science fiction technology, the story is stripped down to the most basic elemental story. If you tell someone the story, it's so simple. It's not even complex, but he like magically interweaves these awesome elements to it to create something completely new, even though the story is a very old story, right?
Yeah. I can't remember who it was who first told me this, but when somebody said to me, the first Alien movie is a haunted house movie.
Yes.
I went, oh yeah, it is. It's just on a spaceship.
Yeah.
But it's 7 people trapped in a haunted house with a monster. That's it. That's the whole movie. Yeah. It's just the monster is so amazing. And they've couched it in such awesome science fiction elements.
Yeah.
I have the Nostromo behind me on the shelf back here somewhere. So it's like just the weird, dirty, grungy technology they're truckers. It's 7 truckers in a haunted house with a monster that's eating their faces.
Yep.
That's it. There's nothing glamorous about this story. There's nothing complex about it. It's just that it just hits us so deeply. But I would argue that the science is pretty good.
Yeah.
And doesn't distract from the amazing writing and characters and the feels, if you will, of the first Alien movie. I think that's one of the things that almost 3 of the Alien movies did really well. Was the science was enough to make it kind of give us a framework, and then we were rooting for the characters the whole time. So so even when the science was a little, we didn't care anymore. Like with Ghostbusters, I don't care about the science in Ghostbusters. It's a great movie.
Go forward just 3 years. Ridley Scott takes his whole combination as a brilliant director, visionary, and he makes Blade Runner, which was an absolute bomb because it was so smart in and of itself. I mean,
Yep.
it has that same feel. A lot of people, I remember when I saw it, they speculated Blade Runner was what was happening on Earth, while Alien was what's happening in space, because they have the feel in the androids, and you're trying to discern the differences. The tests to determine if you're an android or not through the Voight-Kampff computer. So, but it steps up that technology. It steps up the thinking portion of it, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
And man, audiences just couldn't handle it. Right? It completely bombed. It took years before it became the iconic movie, that it is now. It influenced so many things, but it just couldn't be connected. The regular audience could not connect to it.
We're gonna do a whole panel on Blade Runner this year for Monsterama, so I will try and sneak that into the conversation. But when I found out recently that it's in the same universe as the Aliens and the Predators, I went, "What? That didn't know that? Okay, all right, fine. It's Ridley Scott's choice, but it doesn't make any sense to me." So, Kelly, did you have something?
No, not really. I just vibing along.
Vibing along. Okay, so we've got about a little bit more than 10 minutes left here. I do have one more question that I definitely want to ask before we get to the paying of the bills at the end. And this kind of relates back to the fifth grade average reader and the blowing things up to entertain us and have escapism, but also the science getting in the way or not getting in the way. I think we've kind of headed toward this question. So we've talked a lot about movies where either the science is really bad and they just don't seem to care, or that the science is the bad guy, right? Is the disaster in the background that creates the tension and the conflict. But then a lot of these movies, the hero is a scientist. Mm-hmm. How do we reconcile it's science's fault, but the scientist is the hero?
I got something for
that. Okay, Kelly's got to go for this one.
Because immediately what I think of is like not even movies, but like the feud between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Like Tesla had a way that would have been a lot more like green technology, more sustainable. He had all these things, but Edison was the person that kind of shoveled him away. And at the end of his life, Tesla died in poverty, miserable and sad. So, but now we're taking his same like concepts and using them, and we're able to do like more green stuff, whereas Edison was more about burning fuel. So I think there's this definite this notion of like the idea of like whichever scientist, science can be a hero or it can not be, but it's up to us to listen to them and not just be influenced by whoever's more charismatic and has the most cash on hand, which is a real problem for actual scientists with grants and all that.
Yeah, I want our audience to think about this. Think about how many times Tesla has been a character in a movie or a TV show in the last 20 years, and how many times Edison has. Mm-hmm. Right? The artists are getting back at Edison a little bit for this. Rob, you had something for us?
Yeah, I think I was trying to figure out if there's a scientific word for this, but basically when you're making a film, or not necessarily literature can be a little different, but when you're making films, you can take the model of a Western or a war movie or whatever genre it is. Like you could basically take, the lone, guy who comes into town and frees the town. You can take the war movie of the one super soldier that saves, his platoon, and just replace that figure with a scientist, right? Mm-hmm. So you're taking basically the same formula, but instead of a soldier or a sheriff or a bounty hunter, you're using a scientist, right? Or instead of like a Navy captain or a fighter pilot, right? You're using kind of the scientist, and that kind of glorified, scientists. I think, I can recall when Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, just the spike of people that suddenly became interested in archaeology after that movie, right? For example. And sometimes it's done to where people are really interested in that, and it really helps people out. But I think that they just sort of take the same, because we have that fifth grade reading level, and because we have that way of like making everything dumbed down and simple, that they just sort of take patterns we know and just stick the scientist in, which is why the scientist is always either rugged, handsome, and very skilled in combat for somebody who's a man of science, or they're like the nerdiest guy in the room that suddenly goes through a transformation into being like cool.
Yeah, they info dump. They're like, hey, here's how to fix it. Blah. Okay, cool. Go get him, hero.
Well, and I think that scientists make for interesting protagonists because they tend to be pretty logical, and they may not be an
Marlena,
expert.
Sorry, you're crackling a little bit.
You have a lot of cracking. A whole lot.
Oh, sorry. Don't know why. Is that any better?
No, every time you talk, it sounds terrible.
Okay, let me.
Kelly, stay off my team.
Maybe I need to reconnect then.
You want to unplug and replug?
Still... Yeah.
Just the headset I meant, not everything.
I can't hear you.
Muted.
You're muted.
But the crackling went away.
Is that any better?
Oh, that's a lot better. Okay,
good.
So, and go.
I was just going to say that we were talking about, scientists and why they're always being used as protagonists if they're going against, bad science or science gone wrong in this case. Scientists make very good protagonists. They tend to be very logical. And even if they're not an expert in the field that they're studying the monster in, they can be like, wow, I've never seen anything this bad before. So if even a somewhat expert is surprised, that makes you take it more seriously. And you often also see, science regulating science. That's kind of what peer review and stuff like that can be about. So it's interesting. It's interesting.
Dwayne, did you have a comment on this question?
I was thinking about one of the films from our list 90 years ago, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Frederick Marsh in that role, he's just this extremely charismatic as Doctor. In the movie, they call him Dr. Jekyll all through. It's just so bizarre. And but he's very charismatic. Like all these women are like crazy about him and everything else. And he's but he's working to create this potion that can separate the good part of man from the bad part. And I think as I was watching it, the thing that really occurred to me is this scientist who really has everything. And now he's trying to become better, but reality, the science unleashed his bad part, right? So the dark side of him comes out and wins over rather than the good side. So oftentimes I think the science enables the bad part of man or the bad part of the scientist. It gives them the ability or the power to unleash the dark side just as much as it can, becoming its own monster. So the monster may have already been there. And I kind of felt like with the Dr. Jekyll that and I have never read the book. After watching that, I was like, I really need to read this. But I was just curious because my impression was, this is really, this part that through society he has subdued, but now science unleashes this dark side that he had.
Yeah, absolutely. I was so no one gets any points on that question because the answer I was looking for was no, I'm kidding. My answer to the question is that I think it's almost like they're trying to balance things out. Like, oh, the science is scary, but scientists are nice people anyway. And look, this one's all heroic and handsome, and look at his chin, and he's so rugged and everything. There's that. I'm gonna pick on Godzilla again. There's this moment where Matthew Broderick, who is a worm scientist, understands how taxis work. So he takes the thing off the taxi and throws it at the soldier, whose job is to do what the scientist tells him to do through like 70 minutes of this 90-minute movie. So he throws the taxi thing at the soldier, and the soldier goes, "Oh, I'm a soldier and he's a scientist. We both understand how taxis work." What? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Whatever, guys. That's fine. It's all about New York. I think one of the things that's interesting about Frankenstein specifically is that Dr. Frankenstein, because the monster's name is not Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein is the bad science and thinks he's the scientist who's the hero, both. There's a really great debate about whether Frankenstein or the monster is the good guy or the bad guy or neither, which we don't have time for now, but I just love that Dr. Frankenstein really exemplifies both halves of this. Is he thinks he's so heroic, he's going to go kill the monster, but he's the one who made the damn monster in the first place, even though everybody told him not to. So you can almost sum this all up just in that one character.
And
Dwayne?
Well, I was just going to say, if he had owned up to what he was doing, and owned his monster rather than rejecting it, in all likelihood, he could have been a heroic figure, and everything would have turned out completely different. I think that's the real tragedy, is the scientists not owning up to what they're doing.
Yeah. Marlena?
I was just going to say that, and the interesting part is that, you always hear that the villain should be the hero of their own story. They just don't agree with, the actual hero of the story. And for Victor, he's kind of his own enemy in that regard, because he's always second guessing himself. He works really hard to make the monster, and then he's like, oh no, this was a bad idea. I'm just going to act like nothing happened and move on with my life. But that's not how that works. That's when he starts to realize, I think, whenever all of that starts falling apart and the monster starts chasing him everywhere, he's like, maybe I am the bad guy in this.
Yeah. I would love it if there's like a university somewhere in the world that requires you to read Frankenstein before you get your science degree. And the point being, own your consequences, own your science, and the world will be a better place. All right. Speaking of making the world a better place, we got a few minutes left here, but what I want to do is give everybody a chance to do a parting shot. Is there a monstery classic horror science moment that we missed that you want to remind everybody about, or is there some comment you didn't get to make earlier you want to sneak in at the end here? And I'll pick on Marlena first this time.
Well, I was thinking about our discussion with Alien earlier, and what makes the alien monster so terrible is because you do have a team of people who should be able to handle just about anything they come up against. They have all sorts of various weaponry, and they still are overwhelmed by a single creature. It's, if it's a metaphor for being in a haunted house, it's basically the Ghostbusters getting out ghosted in a haunted house.
Yep. Dwayne, how about you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something here that I might pass on this one for.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, you're allowed to call pass. We'll come back.
Right.
Kelly's got her hand up again. We'll come back to Dwayne.
I was just gonna say, like, Dennis Nedry had every reason to rebel against Dr. Hammond and get a bunch of people killed at Jurassic Park, because he was being underpaid and he was the only person involved in tech on the whole island. And again, you cannot hire one science person to handle an entire company.
Yes. Rob, how about you? Any parting shots? Oh, you're muted, Rob. Oh.
There we go. All right. Just keep banging the rocks together. I was going to mention too that, sort of prepping for this and kind of looking through a lot of the stuff that I like and things, in that it's amazing how much of this connection between science and science fiction and popular culture is steeped in Victoriana and Victorian England. And I think that, that era, that era of the Industrial Revolution and that era of change and that era of scientific and technological discovery and industrialization that all happened really sort of created this like fertile environment for people to make these interesting stories. And then I think you see that again after World War II, when you have, the bomb's been dropped, and you've got, between the bomb being dropped and the Cold War, you've got this sort of renaissance of that kind of notion. And then again, as mentioned before, Star Wars comes back, and the technology to make alien worlds not look like, the Gorn in Star Trek is really fascinating. And so I think that we go through cycles of sort of like scientific discovery and advancement and things. And like now, I think coming out of the pandemic, you're going to see more sciencey kind of stuff in films. And you're going to see more like, oh my God, there's a plague. I think we're going to get, much like we got the monster movie in the 50s, we're going to get the plague virus, films of the next 5 years,
Oh yeah.
or The Last Human, or, that whole In a World Where, the Last Human thing, or climate stuff, right? You're going to kind of see that kind of stuff. So I think it is cyclical and it is a product of the times.
Yeah, absolutely. Science fiction reflects the zeitgeist of what we're all worried about. It exploits that, and it's about that, and it should be, because it's not a terrible thing. All right, Dwayne, did you have a response ready for us?
Yeah, I think one of the things, one of my favorite books, hardcore science fiction, would be Dune. And I remember reading it, and I think the thing that always struck me is how there's these visionary aspects. So my background is engineering. And so when they described like the technology, the ornithopters, or even the sandworms, giant monsters, then I had a hard time visualizing how does this work, because I often will try to process that through my mind and through an engineering filter. But then with new movie technology, or the CGI and visionary, so the most recent version of Dune, there's the ability to translate a lot of these science into visual images that hasn't necessarily been there before. And I think it carries over a lot of that capacity to take really good fiction, science fiction, really good science, and make it into something that's processable, if that's a word, inside visually, outside of just the page. So lifting it off the page and bringing it into a visual medium. So I think that's a really exciting aspect of it, and the ability to bring those monsters alive that we've seen inside of fiction.
Absolutely. I will say, as my parting shot, that there's a gentleman who was I believe, a biologist and also an artist. His name was Wayne Barlow. And if you have not Googled him or bought any of his books, at least Google him and go to Google Images and just look up Wayne Barlow, because he's published several books where he went back to classic literature and figured out what the biology would make this thing look like in real life if it was right in front of you. The Dune steersman that he came up with for his science fiction collection, gorgeous, perfect. It's exactly the way the book describes it, because that's the whole point. And he does science fiction, does fantasy, does mythology, does a bunch of stuff. So, Dwayne, to your point, having people be able to take CG and basically follow what the biologists or the physicists or whoever tell them the thing should look like, and make it look exactly like it should look like, I think that begins to help us stay away from, we have to dumb everything down because they're, Americans buying tickets.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I'm not saying that's wrong. I just don't like it. And I'm really appreciating that CG lets the visual elements be more accurate and be more scientifically based, so that we can kind of head in that direction, maybe. Right? The dialogue is next on the list, right? Okay, guys. Thank you so much, everybody. Before we get out of here, I want to remind everybody that in 2023, Monsterama will be coming back as a 3-day show. We're coming back strong. That's on the plan. I believe that they're already advertising weekend and location, everything. So please watch all of the new YouTube videos. Enjoy Monsterama Virtual. And we're still here, guys. We're not going anywhere. So now the last thing I want to do is I want to go around the horn again and let everybody remind us who you are, and tell the Monsterama fans how they can track you down on the interwebs. I'm going to pick on Kelly first this time.
Well, my name is Kelly M. Frank. I am an author, a horror artist, etc. You can find me at morbidsmile.com. And you can also follow me on Ko-Fi /morbidsmile. Yeah.
Excellent. Dwayne?
Yes, I'm Dwayne Todd. I actually published a number of papers about the electric grid and the science behind that. And I published a book on the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, the making of the film and some of the history. I'm working on a few more projects very similar to that. And you can find me at DDT LLC, which is DDT Books. And I'm looking forward to being at Monsterama next year again.
Excellent. Marlena?
My name is Marlena Frank, and you can find my books at marlenafrank.com. I write young adult fantasy and horror, everything from fairies to werewolves.
And Rob?
Run for your lives. The monster's coming.
Dot
Yeah.
com.
.com. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. I can be found on the Earth Station One ESO Network podcast, Modern Musicology, also at needcoffee.com on their Weekend Justice podcast, and writing in the various places and just around the interweb.
Excellent. And I'm still Darren M. Bush. You can find my short stories on the Kindle. You can also find my YouTube channel, Tables of Content, on YouTube, obviously. I'm also going to be participating in the live Monsterama show this year. And I plan on being around for the 23 show, just doing panels and having fun. So thank you, everybody. I want to appreciate you. And this is the part where we wave and smile and say goodbye to Monsterama. See you guys later.